Welcome to the Early Career Professionals in Mapping webinar series. The American Geosciences Institute has partnered with the National Cooperative Geologic Mapping Program to highlight the work of early career geoscience professionals, especially as it relates to the use and production of geologic maps. Each webinar will begin with a presentation from an early career professional, followed by an interview, and then a live Q&A session with the speaker. Kaleb Wagner is currently a PhD student at Czech Academy of Sciences and Charles University. He will discuss his previous experience as a geologist while working with the Minnesota Geological Survey.
Hello and welcome. Thanks for tuning into today's webinar. My name is Kaleb Wagner, and I'm a PhD student and quaternary geologist at the Institute of Geophysics of the Czech Academy of Sciences and Charles University in Prague. Today, as part of AGI's early career webinar series, I'll be talking about my experience as both a user and creator of geologic maps, and more specifically about how geologic maps can be used to convey information relevant to the previously glaciated areas of the Earth. I'll begin with a brief personal introduction, followed by a quick overview of glaciers and ice sheets on Earth and how their histories are represented within the geologic record. I'll then move on to discussing how geologists study and depict this record using maps, and finally how those maps are utilized by other specialists and the general public. So a little bit about me. I grew up on a farm in a very small rural area in the southern part of Saskatchewan, Canada, kind of over in this area on the map. I stayed there for my undergraduate education and then moved to Ontario to complete my master's. After my master's, I began work as a quaternary geologist with the Minnesota Geological Survey and stayed there for about 7 years before making the decision to return back to academia. I'm now in the second year of my PhD here in Prague and getting to enjoy life in Central Europe. So I refer to myself as a quaternary geologist, and the word quaternary in this context references Earth's current geologic period that began about 2.5 million years ago, relatively recently in a geologic sense. And you can see that here represented on this chronology diagram. We know that beginning as far back as 2.5 billion years, or about half of Earth's history, the planet has sustained at times long, typically multi-million year stretches of intensified glaciation, and we refer to these stretches as ice ages. Within any given ice age, Earth's climate cycles between relatively cold glacial phases and relatively warm interglacial phases, and these occur on the order of tens to hundreds of thousands of years. We're actually all currently still living within an ice age, although we're within an interglacial phase marked by the start of the Holocene epoch, which began about 11,000 years ago. At the beginning of the Pleistocene epoch, which precedes the Holocene, large ice sheets began to develop in the northern hemisphere, and these would expand repeatedly into the mid-latitudes and melt away over a series of glacial interglacial cycles. The last time these ice sheets expanded to the mid-latitudes, about 20,000 years ago, they covered about 30% of Earth's land area, whereas today ice covers about 10% of Earth's land area, mostly over Antarctica and Greenland. So there's a lot of area that glacial geologists have to study that was previously glaciated and no longer has any ice cover. So as glaciers and ice sheets grow, they flow largely from colder, higher elevation areas to warmer, lower elevation areas where ice ablates. And throughout this process, they modify the underlying topography and the hydrology of the surface as they advance and retreat. As glacial geologists, we tend to think of different types of environments that are created throughout these processes. So in a simplified sense, this includes sort of the subglacial environment, which occurs at the interface between the ice sheet and its bed. And it also includes a number of proglacial environments, which occur out beyond the ice sheet margin. So different glacial environments tend to generate different types of sediments, and these can be mapped and described by geologists. Some of the most ubiquitous glacial deposits occur as unsorted mixtures of clay, silt, sand, gravel, cobbles, boulders. We refer to these as diamictons, and these generally occur where sediment was physically in contact with the ice. Sorting occurs beyond the ice sheet margin in that proglacial area, for instance, where silts and clays settle out within proglacial lacustrine basins, and when sands and gravels degrade within channelized meltwater streams. So you can see some examples of what these sediment types look like here. So in these subglacial and superglacial settings, you have the development of diamictons, where sediment is in contact directly with the ice. And in glacial settings, these are referred to as tills. Tills commonly incorporate large boulders, like you can see here, amid finer grained matrix materials. You can note here the blue small trowel for scale. In the proglacial setting, and for glacial equestrian environment, for instance, you have the deposition of silts and clays, and these commonly occur in a rhythmically laminated pattern, which we refer to as rhythmites. When rhythmites show any indication of being deposited annually, then we refer to these as barbs. And barbs are really useful because we can use their thickness patterns to establish correlations between different parts of a lacustrine basin. Further afield, in glacial fluvial settings, you have the deposition of outwash, which is typically composed of sand and gravel. When meltwater streams evacuate directly into ponded water, like glacial equestrian settings, glacial marine settings, you often have the development of deltas. Deltas have generally steeply dipping foreset beds, like you can see in this example. And again, note the small blue trawl for scale. So glaciers don't deposit sediment everywhere that they flow. In some places, they also erode the beds and remove pre-existing materials and scour the bedrock underneath. You can see example of scoured bedrock here. So here you have some nicely polished surfaces with some linear grooves cut into them that we refer to as glacial striae. These striae parallel the former ice flow direction, and in some cases, you can have cross-cutting striae sets that show you the evolution of ice flow trajectories through time. Plucking also occurs, which causes these sharply, steeply dipping surfaces on bedrock protuberances. And combination of abrasion and plucking can generate certain types of landforms, like this roche moutonné that you see in this example. And these are also pointing in the direction of former ice flow. Glaciers also generate landforms from sediments through combined actions of erosion and deposition, and these are useful to glacial geologists because they give us indications of former ice flow directions. So probably the most ubiquitous type of glacial landform that we see in glaciated settings are what we refer to as lineations. This is a family of landforms that includes a variety of different types, but the commonality that they all share is that they form these sort of elongate hills that occur within fields, and generally they parallel the ice flow direction. Transverse to ice flow direction, we have the development of subglacial ridges, referred to as ribbed or Rugen moraines. Both of these types of landforms occur within subglacial settings, and they also are commonly associated with one another. Most often they're composed of till, but they may be composed of any type of glacial sediment. And so it's really important that when geologists are making interpretations based off of sediment landform associations, that they actually do the necessary field checks in order to make sure that those interpretations are valid. Glaciers and ice sheets also store meltwater at the base, and they also receive inputs of meltwater from the surface. And so when you have these large inputs into the subglacial system, it needs to drain somewhere, and that's usually towards the margin. This drainage occurs sometimes within conduits, and just like in proglacial meltwater channels, which carry sand and gravel, you also have sand and gravel being transported at the base of the ice sheet. And so as ice sheets melt away, they leave casts of these conduits filled with sand and gravel, and they occur in the form of these sinuous ridges that we refer to as eskers. The last landform example I'll discuss are end moraines, and these are really useful to geologists because they show us the past former extent of ice sheets, because these are actually caused by the ice sheet margin itself, either by thrusting or bulldozing or meltout of sediments. So one of the tools that glacial geologists have in their back pockets that other geoscientists might not have is that we're able to use modern glacier and ice sheet forefields to act as analogs for the paleo record. So to use an example from the last slide where we had those end moraine systems developed in front of Skaftafeldsjökull in southern Iceland, we can look at these also from an oblique viewpoint, and here you can see these sort of elongate linear ponded water features that occur between the ridges, really kind of highlight their morphology a little better. And if we look into the paleo record, for instance, in northern Minnesota in Cook County, we see similar sets of ridges that occur in this LIDAR DEM. And so a glacial geologist might look at both of these landscapes and assume that this example from Cook County also represents an ice marginal land system. Of course, there are extra checks that are necessary when you're making direct one-to-one comparisons, but at least these types of things can help us put first-order approximations on what type of glacial environment we're dealing with. So we've established that glaciers and ice sheets deposit different types of sediments and create different types of landforms within specific environments. But how do we represent this spatially? Of course, this is in the form of maps. So maps within glaciated terrains sort of diverge into two different types. This includes geologic maps, which depict the nature and distribution of sediments, and also geomorphologic maps, which depict spatial morphological relationships between landforms. So geologic maps are primarily concerned with the lithology of different deposits. So this includes things like the mineral composition, grain size, sorting, hardness, things of that nature. Whereas geomorphologic maps are more interested in grouping landforms by similar morphologies, and also providing insight into the processes that are responsible for shaping the landscape. Common to both types of maps are that they're sometimes also interested in depicting the age of a sediment or landform, although generally this requires additional information that isn't always collected at the time of mapping. So each individual mapper has sort of their own preferred way of collecting data and using that data to create a map. But typically, this always involves some interaction between field work, office work, and the laboratory. So generally, work on a new map begins by collecting all the legacy data together. So this includes previous maps and previous data. And nowadays, geologists typically digitize this data and incorporate it within a geographic information system or GIS environment. At the same time, before actually entering the field, geologists will analyze remotely sensed data, things like satellite images and digital elevation models. And from all of this data, we can sort of draw preliminary superficial geology contacts onto our maps. And this will give us an indication of what areas we should start with when we enter the field. So in the field, geologists will, of course, locate their sites using a GPS. They'll document their sites with written descriptions and field sketches. And sometimes they'll take samples and they'll capture photographs. When they return to the office, they put all of this data into their GIS and they reanalyze their line work and make iterative edits in a process that continues back and forth between the field and office. At the same time, they send their samples off to the laboratory, and once those are analyzed, they interpret the results spatially, and that helps inform where they draw their contact lines. So to give some examples of what geologic data collection looks like for me, typically when I'm in the field, I will locate an exposure. Possibly I'll create a sketch in my field book, and this sketch will outline generally the primary contacts and structures that I see. And then between those contacts, I will collect samples of the material and analyze that material to help me interpret what unit I'm looking at. So when I'm looking at the material, I'm focusing primarily on gathering information about color, hardness, texture, mineralogy of the macroscopic grain size fraction. And if I'm able to make any preliminary interpretations, then I record these into my field book. Of course, during any given mapping campaign, you're often exposed to the same units in a consistent stratigraphic position across your mapping area. So eventually, you develop a little bit more confidence in your interpretations and in the stratigraphic positions that you're recognizing. Nice exposures, like you see in this example, aren't always available, and oftentimes they aren't. And so we have to sort of revert to other methods. This can be anything from digging pits with a shovel to using a hand auger to collect shallow sediment plugs. We can also use shallow drilling techniques, for instance, the geoprobe. During my time at the Minnesota Survey, we relied pretty heavily on our Giddings machines. You can see examples of one of these here. So this is a hydraulically operated auger that is mounted to the back of a truck bed. And so there's a rotary head that rotates and also moves up and down this tiltable mast. And the rotary head drives an auger into the ground, which is attached to a series of these steel Kelly bars that we assemble and remove as we both pull up and push down the auger. And so once we have the sediment pulled up, we can sort of peel it off the auger while we record the depths that we penetrated, so that we make sure that we're collecting accurate information with respect to the subsurface. So fieldwork is always necessary to ground truth our mapping. However, nowadays, surficial geologists rely extensively on remotely sensed data sets also in order to accurately draw in their contact lines and to interpret low relief landscape features that might be difficult to see even when you're standing on them in the field. So many Earth observing satellites now collect information across several bands that can be combined to produce false colored images like you see here. Different band combinations highlight different aspects of the ground surface depending on what you're interested in analyzing. Many of these satellites offer imagery that is publicly available. However, there's also commercial sensors, typically with higher spatial or spectral resolutions. Aerial photographs used to be the primary means of generating superficial geology maps in combination with topo maps. Based on differences that you can see in vegetation patterns and relative relief using multiple aerial photographs and photogrammetric methods, geologists would annotate unit contacts directly onto topographic maps. However, I have an example here of a 1 meter LiDAR digital elevation model showing exactly the same area of this aerial photograph. And you can see here that this large moraine feature is really well replicated on this digital elevation model and pretty much entirely obscured in the aerial photograph. And so you can understand why within the past couple decades, superficial geologic mapping methods have really been revolutionized by these types of technologies. So in areas with thicker packages of quaternary sediments, our mapping interests may also extend into the deeper subsurface. Collecting samples of the subsurface usually requires the use of heavier equipment, like the rotary sonic rig that you can see here in this video. So large rigs like this are capable of collecting samples many hundreds of feet beneath the land surface. Typically, when I was working at the Minnesota Survey, our mapping projects would generally include some type of budget for scientific drilling. And this usually occurred during the winter, during the off-season from our typical field work. So when drilling with a rotary sonic rig, the core is extruded into these clear plastic sleeves. And then on site, the geologists chop the core up, put it into core boxes and ship it off to the core shed. And at the core shed, they split the core open, they log it sort of in a similar fashion to how you would log a standard field section by sort of describing the sedimentology systematically and sampling the core at regular intervals. In addition to the scientific cores that we collect, we also maintain an archive of cutting sets at the Minnesota Survey. So these are generally poorer quality samples that were collected during water well installations across the state. And typically most counties will have at least a handful of these available, which are useful at least for understanding drillers' descriptions in certain areas. And in some cases, we can actually look at the mineralogy of these samples as well, which help us establish unit correlations. So once we have all the data we need, how do we actually use this and translate it into a geologic map? In the next sequence of slides, I'll show an example of this based on my experience as a geologist at the MGS. So during my time there, I was part of a team that was responsible for mapping most of the northeastern part of the state up in here. This is an area that's contained within 3 counties, but for simplicity, I'll mostly be talking about the largest of these counties, St. Louis County, which you can see outlined in black here. So the glacial geology of Minnesota is actually pretty complex. It occurs right at the margin of the Laurentide ice sheet and was glaciated multiple times throughout the Quaternary period. So most glacial deposits in the state, at least at the land surface, correspond to the most recent glacial episode, which we refer to as the Wisconsinan. However, in the northeastern part of the state where I worked, generally the glacial deposits were laid down closer to the end of this period, right up against the Holocene epoch that I discussed a little earlier. So as I mentioned before, when we begin a new mapping project, we like to collect all of the available existing data. You can see an example of that for St. Louis County here. Most of this existing data occurs in the form of master's theses, miscellaneous reports, some of them from the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources, other existing maps completed by the MGS, mostly at the quadrangle scale. And then we also have our 1 meter resolution LiDAR digital elevation models that we actually have coverage for across the state. And this forms a nice base for all of the successive mapping. So on top of this existing information, we add data from the Minnesota Well Index. This is a database that houses well construction records and drillers' descriptions that go back over half a century. The MGS partners with staff in each county that help us locate these wells in order to ensure that their coordinates are accurately documented. Generally, these records are pretty poor quality and relatively hard to interpret. But there's a lot of them, as you can see here, and their spatial coverage makes them a really valuable source of information. So data in the MWI are supplemented by descriptions of field sites that were visited by the mapping geologists. So this includes the locations of natural and artificial exposures, getting probe sites, hand auger stations, and pretty much any area where geology has been described in the field. So at a subset of these field locations, geologists also collect samples, and these are processed in-house for grain size determinations. Once we get the grain size data back, we also look at the 1 to 2 millimeter grain size under a low magnification microscope, and we count different types of rocks that we see, and we group them into different categories. You can see sort of those categories listed here for different geologic units based on crystalline carbonate shale percentages, as well as light dark red percentages that help us interpret the different provenances of glacial sediment, or where the sediment is derived from with respect to former ice flow pathways. So a small number of water well locations also contain archived cutting sets like you saw previously. Generally, these are described by geologists, and their interpretations are matched to surrounding water well records. Although scientific cores are also collected for subsurface information, we can use the uppermost intervals as well to inform our superficial geology mapping. So these are assigned similar priorities to our other field locations. So using all of the available data that we have in combination with the knowledge of the glacial history that we get from the existing literature, we can create preliminary superficial geomorphologic maps, which you can see here for St. Louis County, including over 14,000 different features. This includes many landform categories that I discussed earlier, like glacial alienations, end moraines, transverse ridges, eskers, etc. So from there, geologists will generally tend to work on their superficial geology line work. So here they digitize lines directly into the GIS, which represent contacts between different units. And the priority when doing this type of work is just to make sure that all of the data that we have are accurately accounted for. So once we have our line work complete, we work with the GIS team to translate this into polygons. You can see here for the superficial geology map of St. Louis County, we have over 33,000 individual unit polygons that were categorized into 76 geologic units. So mapping is generally carried out at a scale of 1 to 10,000 for these county scale maps, but it's compiled at 1 to 100,000 for most counties. St. Louis County was a little bit of an exception given how big it is, and so for the published map, we compiled at 1 to 200,000. So cross-section lines are drawn across the county at 1 kilometer intervals in order to represent the subsurface geology. The GIS staff work with geologists to set up an environment where they can pull in information from water wells and scientific drill cores within about a half kilometer of each of these individual cross-sections. The geologists then use this data to draw lines across each section that represent the unit bottoms for each individual mapped unit. You can see examples of that type of work up here with the individual water wells coded with different colors based on their lithologies with depth. In St. Louis County, this work required the construction of 181 individual cross-section lines. You can see those here in pink. The northern part of the county wasn't completed because the quaternary deposits are generally pretty thin up there. So even at the 50 times vertical exaggeration that we use to publish these cross-sections, you really can't make out the sediment sequences with any sort of degree of reliability. So after all of the east-west cross-sections have been created, the GIS team takes the unit bottoms that the geologist digitized, and they sample them by adding vertices along each of the lines. Elevation values from these vertices are then used to connect up the unit bases across adjacent cross-section lines. So this creates sort of vector masks that the geologist can then modify to ensure that they're sort of geologically correct. So after the base surfaces are modified, they're converted into rasters, and the tops and thicknesses of the units are calculated algorithmically. And in doing so, you produce a three-dimensional model of the entire subsurface. So this allows us to do interesting things like look at what units are intersected by well casing depths in different areas, like you can see in these examples. We can also look at different units at different depths in the subsurface in plan view, like you would with any other map. And so in these cases, you can see three different sand units depicted here. And the reds and the oranges, these warm colors, show the deeper parts of the units, and the greens and the blues, the shallower parts. There are also contours superimposed on here, but you can't really make them out. But these represent the thickness values for each of the units. So the majority of mapping that takes place these days at the MGS is completed within the framework of the County Geologic Atlas, or a CGA program. CGAs consist of a Part A, which is completed by the MGS, and also a Part B that's completed by the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources. The Part B describes hydrological properties, so things like water levels in aquifers, groundwater flow directions, and pollution sensitivity. CGAs are generally initiated by an expression of interest on the part of the county. So in most cases, counties also provide partial funding or some other type of in-kind support, like helping us locate water wells. The bulk of CGA funding, however, is provided by the Environment and Natural Resources Trust Fund. This is a constitutionally dedicated fund that's overseen by a special commission of the Minnesota legislature. So on the MGS side, each Part A consists of 6 or 7 plates. These include a database plate, like you see here, which shows all of the locations of the data sources that are utilized in both the Bedrock and Quaternary map compilation. It also includes a Bedrock geology map, superficial geology map, Quaternary stratigraphy plate that shows select cross-section examples from across the county, a sand distribution model plate that shows the modeled subsurface sand and gravel bodies, and a bedrock topography and depth to bedrock plate that shows the thickness of quaternary sediment cover and the topography of the bedrock surface when you remove all of the unconsolidated deposits on the top. So glacial geologists at the MGS are typically responsible for the production of superficial geology, stratigraphy, and sand distribution model plates. And then obviously we also have bedrock mappers that work on the other aspects of the CGA. So we spend many years collecting and synthesizing a lot of data to produce these maps, but who actually uses them? What are their applications? Particularly in Minnesota, some of the main users are individuals with interest in water resource management. In many glaciated areas, glacial sand and gravel bodies are utilized as aquifers, both as sources of irrigation and drinking water. Glacial aquifers in particular are commonly confined in the subsurface. You can see that on this schematic here. We have confined aquifer systems sort of sandwiched between confining beds, which are comprised usually of tills or impermeable lake sediments. So it's important with these sort of segmented aquifer systems that we're able to accurately map and determine their connectivity in the subsurface. Subsurface geologic mapping also allows us to understand which units are being tapped most commonly by wells. You can see examples of that here for St. Louis County. These 4 units here are the most commonly tapped units by pumping wells in the county. And we can also look at the distribution of depths within those units, where the casing depths occur. And we can track this over time as well to see whether or not wells are being drilled deeper and deeper into the subsurface to tap new water sources. This is also important because geology can alter the chemistry of groundwater, and we want to avoid pumping from aquifers with elevated concentrations of certain elements like arsenic and cadmium, which can be sourced from certain rock types. Superficial geology maps are also utilized by policy planners and zoning authorities. They contain information on geotechnical properties of surface sediments. Typically, when building infrastructure and housing, we want to be able to avoid areas that are susceptible to hazard. So in most cases, mappable units on superficial maps can be associated with unique degrees of risk. So hazard analysts commonly use geologic maps to assess spatial variability in a number of factors like landslide susceptibility, flooding, erosion potential, radon potential, seismic hazards, etc. We can also use geomorphologic maps to determine hazard susceptibility, for instance, by looking at the distribution of landslide scars, like we see here on this drone video. So if we see a large frequency of these occurring on steeply sloping surfaces, perhaps we don't want to build a lot of infrastructure at the base of these cliffs. And lastly, academics also use superficial geology and geomorphologic maps in order to reconstruct the extent and behavior of former glaciers and ice sheets. So the panels you see here show the evolution of the Laurentide ice sheet in St. Louis County over roughly the last 20,000 years, which is a relatively restricted spatial and temporal frame. But if we scale this up to the continent or the globe, then paleo ice sheet reconstructions can be used more so to calibrate numerical ice sheet models. And these help scientists to predict the amount of future sea level rise that can be expected under different scenarios of Antarctic and Greenland ice sheet melt. And with that, I'll draw an end to my talk by echoing the sentiments of the great Canadian geophysicist John Wilson, who I think here really captures the essence of the geologic map in all of its elegance and its stated orderly simplicity. So thanks a lot for your attention and for sticking through the end, and I look forward to meeting you all in the live Q&A. Thanks.
Kaleb, thank you for sharing some of the work of Minnesota Geological Survey. And Lindsay and I are excited to dive into some of the details of the work you shared and also hear about the work you are doing now. First and foremost, I wanted to ask, how did you become interested in working in geoscience?
Yeah, so I grew up on a farm in a pretty small rural area, and I guess in those type of rural settings, my parents were farmers as well, so it's really sort of instilled into at an early age, like your connection with the earth. And I guess also being in a rural area, we didn't have geoscience education in our school system, so it wasn't until I got into undergrad that I was introduced to geosciences as a formal discipline. And specifically in my third year of undergraduate studies, I studied abroad in Iceland, which was sort of really inspiring for me because most of my courses there involved some type of field work. So we were able to go out and actually look at these different glacial deposits and look at these different volcanic deposits and see the processes happening in real time. And that really sort of triggered something in me, like an interest. And yeah, I just kind of kept pursuing geoscience from then on.
Awesome. During your presentation, you showed some interesting images of data being collected with a probe and a larger rig. I wonder how often equipment like that is used and how might someone collect data that in a more inaccessible area?
Yeah, so drilling equipment is pretty commonly used in quaternary mapping, but as you mentioned, in inaccessible areas, or remote locations, you can't necessarily bring drill rigs into those areas. In northern Minnesota, for instance, lots of the area is covered by peat bogs, and so we would do our drilling in the winter so that we could actually move these rigs in site locations on top of like frozen peat beds, and so we could access the mineral layers underneath the peat. But we also use like ATVs to get around on forest road trails, and actually in large parts of northern Minnesota, specifically in St. Louis County, which I talked about during my presentation, there's a large wilderness area called the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness, and it's about I think like a million acres or something. It's this huge area where there's no road access, and so geologists that work up there have to canoe and look at exposures, along lakes. I also have colleagues that work in northern Canada, and they do a lot of geology by helicopter. So they get to do some really interesting stuff flying into northern parts of Canada or landing float planes on lakes. So there's different ways to get around, but yeah, it's really nice when you have nice road and trail access.
Yeah, it sounds like if you like adventure, go outside, be a geological mapper in remote areas, because kayaks, ATVs, helicopters sounds pretty cool.
Definitely, yeah.
Yeah, and it sounds like you're sharing a lot of the different types of data that you have collected while working for the Geological Survey. So one of the things you talked about were core samples. So I know that the USGS has a repository of core samples. So how does Minnesota maintain their own collection and keep samples that you collect while in the field?
Yeah, so actually all the cores that are collected in Minnesota are archived at a core library that's in Hibbing in Minnesota. It's up in northern part of Minnesota. Most of the cores that are collected there and stored there are exploration cores for mineral targets. It's actually, I think, since the 1980s, it's been a state statute that once a lease terminates, drilling companies have to send these cores to the core library for archiving. I don't think it's actually mandated for scientific cores, but we also archive cores at the core library, and those are all publicly available. So anybody with interest in looking at them can go and access them and sample them. And yeah, so it's a really great resource that we have in the state.
Nice.
Great. And similarly with different data, you mentioned also that there's a well index and that it maybe is a little bit of poor quality, but is really useful information. Is there an effort to check or update it?
Yeah, so the well index is managed partly by the MGS and partly by the Minnesota Department of Health. And when we take on a county geologic atlas, we have a team of geologists that actually goes through all of the well records and looks at the driller's descriptions and then tries to attribute sort of more meaningful geologic descriptions to each of the stratigraphic intervals that they describe. Of course, because we're working from the original driller's descriptions, you know, our interpretations are sort of at the liberty of their original description. So the quality can be sort of variable and poor in certain areas, but as I showed in the slides, there's a lot of wells throughout the state. I think over 500,000 of them. So it's really great spatial coverage that we have, even if the individual records aren't necessarily top quality.
So can you speak to us more about how working at the Minnesota Geological Survey, like the GIS team that you worked at, and like any collaboration that went on while you were doing mapping?
Yeah, so the survey environment at the MGS, it's pretty collaborative, I would say. Generally, for larger counties, we'll have a team of like maybe 2 quaternary geologists working to cover the area. At the same time, we have bedrock mappers that are working in the area. And usually we also have sort of adjacent counties that are being mapped. And so there's a lot of discussion that goes on between geologists, you know, both within their own county and in adjacent counties. Once the geologists, you know, have their geology complete, there's sort of a pipeline where we send our lines off to the GIS team, and they make sure that they're, you know, up to standards in terms of, you know, what the USGS requires for the countrywide mapping, and also up to the standards that the MGS has internally for publishing. And then they also help us to construct GIS environments for the cross-section work that we do for the subsurface work. And so there's sort of a lot of back and forth that goes between the geologists and the GIS team, and also between more senior geologists and the junior geologists, because, you know, we can both sort of share experience in different information that we have.
Right. I'm sure there's a lot of informal training that happens because of that too. So you get like experience from talking to those other experts.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'd say when the junior geologists start, they kind of come in with more of the technology experience, you know, like working with the GIS, working with software, so they can help out the more senior staff with those aspects. But the senior staff have, you know, built careers working in these specific terrains, and so they really have knowledge that's really invaluable and can be passed down to the younger staff.
Great.
And it sounds like from your description that the map making process can be pretty complex, just with all the different people working together and the different maps that are created. How long does a typical map take to make, and kind of what are the steps? Does the superficial map come before the geologic map? Can you give us the process a little bit more?
Yeah, so I think the survey tends to apportion like 3 or 4 years for each individual county geologic atlas. Generally, from the quaternary side of things, we'll be working on the superficial map first. And that happens around the same time that the bedrock geologists are making their bedrock maps. Once we have the superficial map complete, we use that information to sort of fill in the top layer of the cross sections that we do. And so then we can finish out the subsurface geology beneath that. And then once we have all of our cross sections finished, that's when we start building the sand model that I discussed in the talk. So it's sort of an iterative process. But generally 3 to 4 years for a normal county. St. Louis was a little bit different just because it's pretty huge. I think it's 4.5 million acres or something. But we tackled it sort of in part with some of the adjacent counties as well, and we spread out the superficial mapping field season over 4 different years. So we had sort of those maps constructed after 4 years, and then we went on to build the stratigraphy and the sand model. So it depends based on the size of the county.
Awesome, thanks.
Yeah, so I mean, we've definitely loved hearing about your work with the Minnesota Geological Society, but we know that you work and live in quite a different location now. So we were hoping you could tell us a little bit more about what you're working on currently.
Sure. Yeah, so most of my past experience, both at the Minnesota Survey and during my master's, has sort of been mapping within the former extent of the Laurentide ice sheet, which covered, large parts of Canada and the northern U.S. Now, as you mentioned, I'm over in Europe and working primarily in northern Europe, looking at the former extent of the Fennoscandian ice sheet. And so we're actually looking at older glacial deposits beyond the last glacial maximum extent. And so you can see on this slide here, there are sort of different ice sheet extents that are indicated here. And the LGM, so about 20,000 years ago, is shown here in green. And beyond that, we don't really have good information about the age of glacial deposits. I mentioned during my talk that when you're mapping, sometimes you're also interested in looking at the age of the sediment or landform, but you need to collect additional information. And so that's what we're doing sort of with our field work here. Up on the right-hand side, you can see we have a bunch of field locations spanning between the Netherlands and Lithuania. So we're collecting samples sort of along this quaternary maximum extent. And these are buried glacial deposits, so they occur pretty deep in the subsurface. So what we're using is a technique called terrestrial cosmogenic nuclide dating, and specifically burial dating. And so terrestrial cosmogenic nuclides are generated when you have cosmic rays that are interacting with minerals in a rock. And so in quartz specifically, you have the production of beryllium-10 and aluminum-26 isotopes. And so we know that these are produced at a certain ratio at the surface of the Earth, around 7 aluminum to beryllium ratio. But as these are buried, then that ratio is depressed. And so based on that decay, we can sort of determine how long these deposits were buried. And so when we're grabbing samples from these buried sections around Northern Europe, then we're trying to date these glacial deposits and correlate them between different sites. So the work involves a lot of time in the laboratory. So we take our rock samples, as you can see here. I won't go through all of this. It's a little bit convoluted, but basically we do a lot of physical treatments, work with a lot of acids. We end up with these nice quartz concentrates that you can see here on the right-hand side. Once we have those, we dissolve them in some hydrochloric acid, and we use column chromatography to isolate the aluminum beryllium phases. And then once we have those isolated, then we can press them into cathodes and we measure them on AMS, like you can see here on the right-hand side. These are big machines that take up a whole room, but we get the ratios of the aluminum-26 and beryllium-10 to their stable isotopes, and that tells us, and then from that we can calculate the burial age.
Thanks so much for sharing, Kaleb. It's interesting to know that your past experience really was in field work and mapping, and now you're in the lab, getting some experience that way. And so what do you think the future holds for you? Are you more of a lab work guy or field work preference?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know. I really like, sort of both aspects of the job. I really like being able to be in the field, do mapping, kind of stick to the traditional geology roots. But I also like research. And so I think ideally, as a middling PhD student, I'm sort of open to any opportunities that will come my way. But ideally, I'd be potentially working at a federal level survey that has some type of mapping program, but also incorporates some research into their day-to-day activities.
Great. Well, Kaleb, I'm so sorry to cut us short today, but thank you so much for taking time to talk with me and Lindsay. And hopefully we have a couple minutes now where we can have a Q&A from the audience. And so we'll kick it over to us live. Thanks so much, Kaleb.
Thanks for having me.
Hi, everyone. We will now move into our discussion session where Kaleb can answer questions that you might have. And you can ask your questions by typing them into the chat, and then my colleagues Sequoia McGee and I will share them out with Kaleb. Hi, Kaleb. And to get our discussion started, I wanted to ask, why is it important for us to know about glaciated terrains, and what can this allow us to know about an area?
Yeah, that's a good and general question, but I think it sort of depends on what area you're looking at. Like, as I mentioned, in Minnesota, a lot of the reasons that people are interested in looking at superficial maps and subsurface quaternary geology maps are for water resource management. But in other areas, it might be more related to mineral prospecting or to hazard management. So it really kind of varies based on the type of terrain that you're mapping.
Thanks, Kaleb. And our first question in the chat asks, has there been any pursuit to incorporate subsurface information that may be obtained from the state's DOT or Department of Transportation geotechnical explorations?
Yeah, so at the survey, we commonly incorporate some of that data from like bridge borings, for instance. A lot of it hasn't necessarily been digitized before, so we sort of have to go do the work of actually finding the original places where it was published. But once we get that into our databases, then we can use it within our GIS and incorporate it just like any other type of data. Yeah, it is also variable information. It's usually described by a geologist, so it's helpful, but maybe not as helpful as some other sources like we would collect ourselves.
Great, thanks. Next question is, in your research, have you found new information about the formation of drumlins, formation under ice compared to the formation during ice retreat?
Okay, that's a pretty hot button topic, I would say. I think that a lot of that research is still ongoing, and it's kind of been going on for decades. And I'm not necessarily going to take a stand here on one side or the other, but there's a lot of different work suggesting perhaps that drumlins are completely erosional, or perhaps they're completely generated by deposition beneath the ice sheet, or some form in between. Now, with a lot of the modeling studies that are coming out, they're showing that there's some type of potential instability at the ice bed interface that can interact to cause transitions between different types of subglacial bed forms. But it's ongoing, and it's nothing that I've contributed to necessarily personally through my mapping.
Two questions in the chat asked about resources related to glacial mapping, and I believe you responded with a couple of links. Do you want to share anything else related to resources?
Yeah, there's aside from the links that I shared, there's some great textbooks out that are commonly used by undergraduates and graduate students alike, by Ben and Evans, Glaciers and Glaciations, as well as some from my former master's advisor, John Menzies. He's published a few textbooks. And so those are really good at just giving a general overview of different types of glacial environments and how we can sort of interpret them in the geologic record.
Great, thanks for sharing more resources. The next question in the chat is about urban expansion. It says, urban expansion is dependent on land and water availability. Geological maps are essential for soil and water management programs. And statistically, what is the coefficient of variation with respect to the diameter of sediments in their chemical and mineralogical composition? And follow up, how many series of soils have you been able to identify in your study?
Okay, I don't know that I can answer this in terms of statistics, but I will say that grain size definitely is important when we're talking about water management because coarser grain sediments are generally more permeable, so they allow water to be transmitted through different types of soils and different types of sediments. Whereas when you're looking at like silts or clays or more compact sediments, they're generally impermeable. So it's kind of like I showed in my talk where you have those impermeable layers in the subsurface that act as confining layers for aquifers. So it's really sort of important to have a good understanding of the grain sizes that you're looking at in your area. How many series of soils? I don't know that I have a number for that. But, and in generally, I guess I can also say that soil science is sort of a separate discipline from glacial geology in that soil scientists look primarily at the upper 3 feet, and they have a much better understanding of how the land surface interacts with water and oxygen compared to what we generally study.
Great, thanks. And just as a follow-up for that question, if there are any questions that we can't answer here today, we're going to supply an email address at the end or in a couple minutes. So then feel free, if you want to re-ask that question, we can send that on to people that have an answer as well. Thanks, Kaleb.
You're getting hit heavy with these questions, Kaleb. I have another one for you. Have you considered the implementation of Python and artificial intelligence in your work, and specifically to establish geologic risk maps and the implementation of management plans and mitigation plans?
Yeah, personally, I'm a pretty amateur coder, I would say, but there's definitely a lot of people using big data, machine learning, lots of different coding environments to answer different types of questions, specifically, like you say, related to hazard management. I'm not as familiar necessarily with superficial geologic mapping. More recently, I would say there's some work being done with object-oriented programming languages to automatically delineate glacial landforms from digital elevation models. So that's something that's occurring, but I can't tell you necessarily for superficial mapping.
Great, thanks. And we have probably time for 2 more questions. So the next question is, my impression is that there was a lot of work on the upper Midwest glacial stratigraphy a few decades ago, but then research has slowed, perhaps from a lack of accurate dating methods in lowest deposits. Is there a lot of potential to disambiguate pre-Wisconsin lowest deposits with modern dating methods?
That's a good question. So dating methods kind of have historically been a little bit of a limit to glacial geologists in terms of looking at pre-Wisconsin glaciations, with the limit of radiocarbon dating being only about 50,000 years. More recently, we've had developments with OSL dating and now feldspar IRSL, which allows us to get back to 500,000 years. With the Cosmo work, the stuff that I'm working on now, we can date sediments back to 5 million years. So we're kind of getting a much better handle on sort of the older parts of the stratigraphy. And I think that interest in that has also been rekindled a little bit.
And before I ask the last question, Kaleb, I just want to point out you're getting a lot of love in the chat, just if you get a chance to look at it.
Perfect. Always love that.
And so for the last question, how would you use data or maps to show the length of time that a deposit has been buried?
Sorry, can you repeat that one?
Sure. How would you use data or maps showing the length of time that a deposit has been buried?
Buried. I suppose you could use it with sort of any other type of topological layer that you would use with mapping. I haven't necessarily seen burial maps before, but I can imagine it being something that could be done if you had enough data points and enough money to actually date buried deposits within your study area. So it's definitely possible, but it's not something that I'm familiar with.
Great, thank you so much, Kaleb. And that's about all the time we have for today. If you have any additional questions, you can email us at the link in the chat, and we will pass your questions along to Kaleb. Within the next week, we will be posting the recording of today's webinar on both AGI's YouTube channel and the webpage, and we will notify all attendees once the recording is available. Thank you, Kaleb, for sharing your time, expertise, and insight with us today.
Great. Thanks so much for having me. Thanks, everyone, for joining.
And next up in our Early Career Professionals in Mapping webinar series is Shadia Al-Ashkar, a geologist with the West Virginia Geological and Economic Survey. She will discuss mapping of sedimentary rocks in West Virginia on January 10th. A few more details about the talk and register using the link in the chat. And if you are an early career professional in mapping or know someone who is, please encourage them to apply to be a speaker in this ongoing series. Applications will be open in January for the next round of speakers. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you in January.